She was one of the Forbes 30 Under 30 in media in 2013, and you might know her from her award-winning blog, Racialicious. Everybody, let's hear it for Latoya Peterson.
Good morning, Portland. How are you?
Yeah.
Excellent. Let's bring in some energy. You guys felt like a great crowd. I was listening to a lot of Paul's talk. It was very, very fascinating. And I loved how he's talking about computers coming in at you. It made me think a little bit of Skynet, but just a little bit of this computing coming to you. So I want to talk, for my portion of this wonderful, wonderful event, about pushing technology out, all right? Let's take technology into a different type of space, all right? What does it mean when we talk about mobile? Now, it seems like a really simple question, right? Most of us are walking around with mobile phones, we're thinking about mobile internet, we're thinking about SMS. Why do we need to rethink the idea of mobile? Well, the thing is, this first occurred to me, I'm a journalist by trade, and I was researching how different communities get information. How are people informed, right? How do we communicate things to different types of populations? Because there is an information gap, and there is a digital divide. And so how do you make sure that the information you need gets to the people that need it the most? And a lot of times these people are not necessarily connected in the ways that you think of. And I noticed, particularly in the tech space, a lot of the emphasis was being put on mobile and particularly apps. Apps, these little self-contained programs that we download to our phones, that we request people to download, that we ask them to use on a regular basis. And they're essentially these little closed systems. So I started thinking, okay, well, what else could it be if it's not apps? What's happening with apps? Why are people so focused on apps? And apps are beautiful, and apps are sexy, and apps are very fun. But are apps the most effective way to reach a mass amount of people? In 2010, I did a Public Media Corps fellowship in Washington, D.C., which looked at connectivity and the digital divide in predominantly urban areas and predominantly low-income areas. And one of the things that we discovered in our research, we did this huge street survey. We were taking out hot bottles of water and handing them out to people, asking them about their digital practices. They all thought we were so weird, and we didn't make any sense. We were running them down at bus stops like, will you please take the survey about public media and digital stuff? But one of the things that we learned was so valuable because it had never been attempted at that level. And a lot of the surveys that people were giving about the digital environment in Washington, D.C. in particular, were toward these very self-serving populations, or these self-selecting, populations. These people who were more inclined to answer things, who were more inclined to fill out a Google form, who were more inclined to answer a survey. And so we were literally running down people at bus stops, people in the street, people who were on their way to a splash park, people who might not ever respond to those types of surveys. And what we found was that our initial ideas about the digital divide were flawed. It wasn't that people did not have access to higher level technology. That is the case sometimes. But a lot of people had smartphones, right? They had BlackBerries, they had iPhones, they had all kinds of things. But people weren't downloading apps. They just used the mobile-ready website. They just surfed the internet. And they tried not to use data. So it was a very interesting way for us to start shifting how we thought about the types of technology that people had and what they were doing with it. It was very, very different. And so the idea then became, if we're looking at a smartphone revolution, if we're looking at this, this idea of having everything that you need at your fingertips, that smartphones have revolutionized our lives, what happens when everyone's not using them in the same way? And are we becoming slightly over-dependent on smartphones? Now, I love smartphones, don't get me wrong, right? They are amazing. They are just this wonderful facilitator of my life. I left my wallet on the plane on the way in here, which is a terrible event. And then I was like, wait, I have Apple Pay. This is great, right? There are so many things that were fixed because of the smartphone that I had in my hand. But that's one particular type of device. What if I had had an Android? What if I didn't have Google Wallet enabled? What if I didn't know about it? How would that work? At the same time, what we see a lot, particularly in tech circles, is this idea that phones will kind of solve everything. Phones will solve all kinds of problems. There's this great book that came out called Alone Together that's talking about why we started relying on technology instead of relying on kind of like the mesh network of people that's always around us. How do you find restaurant recommendations now? Do you ask the people around you, the conference? Do you ask the concierge? Do you fire up Yelp? What's your pattern? How do you find it? It's different for everyone, but it's interesting to see that our patterns are starting to shift away from interacting and asking people for things, and instead to focusing entirely on these smaller and smaller screens that we have in our hands. The other reason why I'm a little bit skeptical of apps is because apps can have unintended consequences, right? How many of you guys know about or use Nextdoor, right? On its face, Nextdoor is a great app. It's amazing, it's interesting, you can connect with your neighbors, it's a closed system, so you guys can like post messages and boards and all these things. One of my colleagues at Fusion, Pandarvis Harvishah, wrote a piece about racism on the Nextdoor app in San Francisco. And how even if you are a neighbor and you happen to be African American like me, you might start feeling really unwelcome on Nextdoor because you're looking at the comments your neighbors are posting about other African Americans, or sometimes even yourself as a person that looks sketchy or things like that. So even if there's an application that's trying to invite people in and say, let's all foster these connections, there are other factors at play that might be pushing people away from your app that you might not even know about. But are apps the only thing that we can use? It kept getting stuck in my head, this idea, like, okay, if we're not using apps, what are we going to use? We're going to use SMS, or we're going to use texting. What can we use? What can we do? So I started thinking about how do you make the environments around you interactive? To me, when I started looking at the ways in which different people were using technology in Washington, D.C. and in other areas that I ended up working in, I realized that one of the things that we have in common is us moving through public space, right? When we're walking around, we're going downtown, we're going to our buildings, we're going to restaurants, we're going to work. And there are all of these almost missed opportunities to capture our attention. Now, this wasn't always the case, right? There were billboards that were designed to catch passerbys' attention. Advertising and wall-based advertising is still very popular. But it's like we haven't quite digitized this process. We haven't started melding the physical and the digital in ways that could really benefit people. And so I started thinking about how we could work to facilitate and create interactive public space. What does it mean if we are all in the same area, if we are all in the same room, if we are all here together? How is the best way for me to communicate to you? You guys are all listening to me talk right now. That's one way of communication. But if I had asked you, everybody go and download this app, how many of you could do it? I mean, we're at TechFest Northwest. A lot of you would be able to do it. But what if I had designed that app for Windows 8 interface? How many people will be able to do it? What if I decided later, okay, we'll launch this app now, but we'll launch the other one later? It starts to leave people out of the occasion. It starts to self-selecting. So in a way of trying to democratize the information that's being served, I started looking at other solutions. MIT's Media Lab had this cool thing called the living wall. And it was essentially a piece of circuit board that was flexible and that you could post on the wall and you can touch it. And once you touched it, a sound would happen. And they made it look like a jungle, so it was like you hear, little like jungle sounds and things like that. It was a very cool concept. And so I was like, well, I wonder if we could replicate that around DC. If we could put up all this flexible circuit board and have people touch it. But then I realized, okay, that might not work. Because if that happens, people could tear down the circuit board. So what else is there? What else can we do? Is there something we can do with the space? Is there something we can do with the walls? And that's how I started the projection projects that I ended up working on at Stanford for my night fellowship, of figuring out the system of both projection, to project one thing on one side of the wall, and then an intake system that allows you to interact with the wall as if it was an interface, something that you could port anywhere, something that you can take anywhere. And so I was like, okay, if I could do this, and we've seen various use cases, and you'll see those a little bit later in my presentation, where can I put it? Where is a space where there's a lot of different type of people, from a lot of different demographics, from a lot of different walks of life? The laundromat. I started really trying to think of spaces and places that would allow me to test this in a way that wasn't necessarily self-selecting, right? A laundromat is for people who don't have laundry at their house. It could be a lot of people, right? It's me at the moment. I'm having a renovation. I'm in the laundromat once a week. And watching the interplay of people, you're going to be there for a certain period of time. You're going to be stuck there waiting for a machine for at least an hour. What information can we give people? Can we give them news broadcasts? Can we give them information about civic initiatives? Can we give them information about their libraries? Can we give them something to read? Can we give them something to play? These are all these different ideas about what we can do in this space. So normally when I start telling people about mobile beyond devices, they get really excited and they start having all kinds of ideas. So I want to open this up. right? We have the new hashtag, WeAllWinPDX, so you can feel free to tweet your responses, but where do you think is a site, a public space where we could test this idea of trying to figure out how to foster better interactions? Are there any ideas floating to the top right now? The bus. Ooh, that's a good one. The bus. Right, so you're on the bus in the morning. What do you do? So the buses, particularly in most systems, I'm mostly on the East Coast, based in DC, and I spend a lot of time in New York. And so they've optimized your stops. They've optimized where you're going, but what else could there be, all right? The bus bays have the ports for digital advertising, right? But what else can we put there besides advertising? What else could be there? What else could we be using for people? Could we put public health information? Could we put programs about assistance to home buyers that we have in DC? We have this great program that a lot of people don't know about. Could that be in the bus space? So it's just really a matter about thinking about public space differently. Any other ideas? I'm sorry, which one? DMV. The DMV and bathrooms. So in DC, the DMV actually does have screens set up that run like a news ticker. But I think it'd be more fun, particularly at the DMV, where it's like a high-stress area to be in, right? You're normally at the DMV because you have to be. You don't want to, like, nobody goes out there. It's like Tuesday, let's go to the DMV. I would think it'd be fun to start doing some kind of like interactive game, something that'd be very cool, and let's look at how that could look in a couple minutes. And I think I heard one other thing. Was it bathrooms? Someone said bathrooms, right? So in a public restroom, that's a really interesting place, right? I used to read Adbusters all the time, and Adbusters would talk about like you can't even be left alone in the bathroom. Somebody put an ad up in the back, and now you're trying to pee, and you're looking at an ad you're being sold to. And I was like, yeah, that's brilliant. So I'm always like worried about that. But on the outside of the bathroom, there is a lot of space, particularly in airports. What would be useful in an airport bathroom to know? That my flight is delayed? That would be totally useful. Where is the closest bar? That would be useful. Like there are a bunch of things that are useful that we can optimize this space, right? And there's a bunch of ways to try to figure out interactions with other people in these spaces. So feel free to keep tweeting and keep sending your responses to WeAllWinPDX. But I'll start going into some things that have been done and that are projects in process to kind of get you thinking about what else mobile can be.
For Mashable, I'm Lauren Goris. The New York Times Research and Development Lab is justifying your vanity. They've created a new mirror that will bring you media while you're doing your hair. It's called Reveal, and it works like this.
Mirror, show me the weather.
Or if you're looking for news,
You can look at the headlines as they scroll down below. And if there's something you like, you touch your phone to it, you can take it on the subway.
along with weather, news, and other content you'd find in the Gray Lady, Reveal also syncs with digital health tools like Jawbone's Up. An embedded Microsoft Connect allows Reveal to respond to users' voice commands and gestures. And the Next Web reports the tablet-looking mirror uses augmented reflection to sense and display graphics to, for example, give you a timer when it sees you brushing your teeth. The Next Web says Reveal is part of a trend. It seems.
So you have something like Reveal, right? So the New York Times R&D lab made that for personal and home use. But can you imagine how useful that might be, say, at a public library? All right, you go wash your hands, use the restroom, and then down at the bottom there's information of events that you might not have known about because you're at the library that day and not necessarily the next day. Can we look at ways in which you can inform people, ways in which that we can talk to each other more? It's very interesting. Let's look at this next one. This one needs a little bit more of a setup. The University of Brisbane was doing a project where they wanted to look at city stories. And the first time I saw this particular project, they had basically put LED lights on bike spokes and they made it display the weather. And that was a way of kind of looking at mobile communication in a different way. And so it's been 2 years since that project launched initially on the Kickstarter and got funded and people have been playing with it. This is what the University of Brisbane did, an interactive tour of their city based on a bike. kind of a glimpse of the history of the city based on geolocation that they put into this bike spoke so that people that you are passing while you are biking are also getting information. So the possibilities for this are starting to unfold in very, very interesting ways, right? Let's look at one more. Let's look at a collective out of Baltimore called Luminous Interventions. And when I first started researching this, they were just projecting things on buildings, which was really, really effective. They did one across a bridge in Baltimore where they said, people live under this bridge. And just having that message there, reinforcing that there are lives and there are people under here, was very powerful. And now they've managed to take it to the next level by using that same kind of push-pull technology I outlined for you before, the connect and the projection, to create a game about people and businesses that are evading taxes in Baltimore and what the effects are. Oh, so the video game is called Tax Invaders. It's based on Space Invaders, in case you haven't noticed. And they were projecting it on Bank of America's building.
Art and activism coming together in play. It actually translates incredibly well to a game, which I think further brings home the message of where power actually lies in the culture.
Going against the system is hard work. It'll make you sweat. But that's okay. People are also resilient and we just keep coming back.
So you're able to use, through rethinking how we look at this type of technology, to take something that's traditionally very, very boring and buried in the back of the business section, right? This idea of tax evasion and loopholes and what it's doing to the foundation of a city, and then make that this interactive experience that anyone can walk up, as long as you can actually, if you bring your whole body there and you can play this game, you are now involved in that conversation. So like I said, the possibilities for this are fascinating, and they do not have to be expensive. I'm a big fan of using what you have, right? And that, when I was at Stanford, I loved these huge displays that they built around, particularly the business school, that were these beautiful, dynamic, huge screens that were thousands and thousands of dollars a pop, right? That's not replicable in municipal environments, right? Most libraries can't afford a $15,000 display that might take $5,000 a year to maintain. They can't afford that. There's too many other competing priorities in the budget. But if we're using these projection and these technologies, we can start to hack together and find solutions that are portable, that are open source, and that are available to a lot of different people regardless of what you're able to spend, right? The small kit that you see right up there, the small kit, is the thing that I made just at Stanford of things that I had. It's my own Android phone. It's a $50 speaker. The Connect is $99. The Pico projector was the most expensive thing at $400. And then being able to play with that and go back and forth and figure out what you can make with it really allows more people to get into this idea of interactive public space. There are also existing places that we could port, right? How many people have played Fruit Ninja, right? Easy, fun interface, which they have now put into malls, right? And so you can see this kid having a great time, I think. Oh, that's not gonna play, that's fine. This kid having a great time playing Fruit Ninja in the mall, but what else could you have put in that display? What else could be there? So I wanna end my talk by saying that the future is ours to shape, right? We are the architects of this. We are the ones that decide what happens, and there's really no need to build inequality into a system when there's just a little bit more imagination and a little bit more creativity, and we can make the future that we want to see. Thank you.
Let's hear it for Latoya Peterson. Thank you so much. You want to have a quick seat? We have our mics out in the audience. Do we have any questions for Latoya? Questions for Latoya? Okay, all the way in the back.
Okay. Oh, you have to hold it? Okay. Hi. My name is Alex Gross. I'm with Chamber DS. We're a mobile innovation company here in Portland. But I want to just kind of quickly ask you to elaborate on that last thing you said about inequality. I feel like I want to just kind of learn more about the inequality that you see happening out there. And so that, I don't know, at least I could be more aware of what I'm not noticing.
Cool. That's an excellent question. So the thing that I'm learning, and I've been doing anti-racist work since 2006 or so, through the blog and looking at kind of systems of inequality. And you kind of have to look at it through multiple lenses, right? You look at it region. So what's happening in Portland is not going to be what's happening in DC. It's not going to be what's happening in New York. It's not going to be what's happening in Atlanta. It's not going to be what's happening in Nashville. They're different spaces or different areas, right? And they have different histories. And so really kind of being in community with people is a big way of understanding kind of where inequality is happening in your space and where you can rectify it, if there are places that we can enter the conversation. In terms of broader, more national trends and more multinational trends, Jesse Washington of the Associated Press did an article a few years ago about the new digital divide. And he was talking about how differently people were seeing the technology and how his conclusion was that we should teach students to better use desktop-based technology because they were very fluent in mobile, but they had huge gaps. And there are things that you can't do easily on a mobile device, like edit your resume or like upload your resume or cover letter, or to even fill out a lot of government forms. It's very difficult on mobile devices, and his solution was kind of, we should make it so that it's more accessible and that people learn like this basic digital literacy in school. But I was like, if we're looking at where people are and where trends are shifting, right, and we're looking at all kinds of places, like if you look on the African continent, right, they've leapfrogged. So desktop has kind of been bypassed for the most part outside of cyber cafes, and people use their mobile device as dominant. So wouldn't the onus then be on us to create better interfaces that you can use through a mobile phone? It's just one way of thinking about the problem, right? We can say, you need to come into the way that we do things, right? You need to have, a desktop, you need to have a formal resume, you need to have these things together, and you can use your mobile for play, for fun, for other things. Or we can say, okay, how do we invite more people in? If people are struggling and the only thing they have access to is a mobile device, how do we make this easier for them? How do we make these things accessible there? So that's one site, kind of an inequality. Another site is just literally in how people think about the technology that they have, right? A lot of people are not aware of the things that you can do with a smartphone. My friend Baratunde Thurston tells a story. I think he told it in the beginning of How to Be Black, but of his book, How to Be Black, I'm not 100% sure. But he tells a story one time he was in New York, and a woman was lost, and she was like, excuse me, do you know how to get to this building? And so he pulled out his phone, this was a few years ago, and he opened Google Maps, and he, pulled it up, told her instructions, showed it to her on the map, and she was astounded that this technology existed. Now, Google Maps had been out for a few years at that point. And then before that, there was MapQuest, there were a lot of different things that you could be using, a lot of different programs, a lot of different tools. But these tools aren't reaching people when they need them, how they need them. There's just not that level of comfort in some ways. And so figuring out how do we bridge those gaps and how do you make people more comfortable asking people about technology, asking for help, finding out other ways that they can use things and making it so that it's not, okay, we'll go here and then download this and then open this and then log in with this, but finding ways to simplify these processes so even people who are not as digitally savvy can use the things that we're creating. Another big thing that people don't talk about often in terms of digital inequality is literacy. Literacy is huge because if you cannot read well, you generally don't understand the interfaces. You don't understand what the form is asking you to do in the first place. I actually have a friend, a very good friend of ours, my husband's, and he was educated in Mississippi, and he is functionally illiterate. I have seen him sweat for 2 hours over a standard job application form that would have taken me 3 minutes to fill out, all right? When he goes to apply for jobs and he goes to these automated forms, he's already trying to overcome two barriers. He's trying to overcome his lack of literacy and the interface that they've chosen to give it. Like if you apply for a lot of service jobs now, I'm not sure if you guys are in that world and you understand this, they have computer kiosks set up. You don't talk to anyone anymore. And so for people who were trained by their parents who were saying, you go to a job site, you go to Starbucks and you say you want to turn in an application, you go to Home Depot and you ask them if you have a job. And to be directed to a kiosk that they need to use is a barrier that might not be climbed. Like these are some, so there's a lot of big issues and it kind of depends on your community, where you're coming from, what's happening. But I think that the big part and big benefit of leveling the playing field is you start to see such interesting and original ideas come out of the space. You know, I like to call it the San Francisco problem, where San Francisco is great. It's like tech playground, right? But everyone is solving for the needs and the desires of mostly affluent 20 to 30-year-old tech professionals, right? Like, these are the people that we're solving for. There's so many individual apps to solve like increasingly minute problems. Whereas, you know, the big news story of San Francisco, apparently, I haven't lived there since 2013, but the big news story these days is like human crap on the street. I'm like, there's no app that's gonna solve that. That's compassion, right? Like that's understanding people, that's talking to people, that's making space for people. And so looking at, a lot of it is just literally like talking to people, finding out their needs, and then working to that instead of necessarily kind of assuming what somebody wants. Because it's easy for us, those of us who really work in tech and we live it and we breathe it, to think, oh, it's really simple and all we have to do is create this easy solution, go on GitHub, tell me this thing. And instead take a step back and think about, okay, well, what are you familiar with? Are you familiar with flyers? Are you familiar with radio? We had a pop-up Stevie Wonder concert in DC, which was great. They announced it at 6 a.m. and it was for 10 a.m. And it was free. You just had to get there. And it was interesting to hear people in the crowd talking about how they understood it. For African Americans in the crowd, particularly older African Americans, they heard it on the radio. They were listening to 102.3. For the younger people in the crowd, younger African Americans, younger white people in particular, they saw it on Twitter or Instagram. Two different populations, right? So just thinking about the different populations that might be using tech is a big step forward. Okay, I think that answered the question, mostly.
Yes, thank you. Any more questions out there?
Thanks. I heard you talk a lot about consuming content or getting news. What about the ability for communities and disparate groups to produce the news?
Excellent question. And so the question becomes, what does it take to make everyone a news producer? And it's something that if you had asked me this question 3 years ago, I would have been like, oh, we just come, we do cramps. Like, that's what we did with the Public Media Corps. We literally had these like social media workshops set up, and we would come to street fairs, we'd come to places and be like, this is how you use Twitter, this is how you use tech, this is how you use the camera on your phone to shoot things. We went to Anacostia High School and I taught them like how to make a beat in GarageBand, and they were like amazing, like it was so great. But I started to realize something, right, when I was doing all of these things in terms of making people producers, and that has unintended consequences. So Black Lives Matter has been in the news, police shootings have been in the news, and because of the prevalence of cell phone cameras, we are now seeing things that we could have never seen before. It was cell phone cameras and body cameras. Does anybody follow the stories of what happens to people after they post these videos? New York Magazine did a huge expose on, I believe his name is Ramsey Orta. He was the one who shot the Eric Garner I Can't Breathe video. And how it's very interesting, right? Ramsey was just a regular guy. He had been in trouble with the law a little bit. He was working kind of like on his jobs. He's still living with his mom. Like, you know, he's living a kind of average life, right? Nothing too special, nothing too exceptional. And as a result of him uploading the video, he claims that he has been under a campaign of harassment. The police just roll by his house. They shine lights into his window, all kinds of things. They've scared his mother and his sister to the point where he says he regrets doing the right thing. And that's one of those particular things I think about a lot being in journalism and really being a big advocate of civic journalism and people telling their own stories and people being empowered. It's also that if you're not with an institution, you don't have protection. You might not know what your rights are. You might not know what things are. And so like the ACLU dropped the Cop Watch app, which is amazing. But again, it's an app, right? So how do you make sure that information is to people when they need it? I got a call from my friend Kim, who was recording a police stop that was happening in an area. And the police had asked her for her phone, and she goes, for evidence. She was not necessarily involved in this, she was just recording. And she called me, she was like, I need to call someone I trust. She called me, and she was like, do I have to give them my phone? And I'm literally Googling like the ACLU website, like I'm going, does she have to turn this over? I don't think so. I think you can say something else. But you know, what you think in the moment versus what actually happens in the moment are totally different things. And so I found that my personal activism started to shift toward understanding these dynamics and safety and being able to like fully equip people when we equip them. But at the same time, being media producers, I think is particularly in this generation that's coming, kind of like the cusp of Y and Z, right, is completely native to them. Like they have learned and they've come up in this remix culture where all of these things are much more readily accessible than they were. And so I spent a lot of time on Vine and looking at like how people are cutting and chopping and using these videos and doing advanced software and doing these advanced cuts and creating these very complex stories you tell in 6 seconds. And I'm amazed at it. I think that if you give people a platform, be it a soapbox, be it a mic, be it, you know, a stage, they will use it and they will happily use it. And so I think the solution is, one, getting these platforms in the hands of more people and making people on my end understand that there's many more places people are coming from besides journalism school. But also then equipping them to understand what that means when you step on the stage and then how to do so ethically and to keep themselves safe. Did that answer your question?
Great, thanks so much. Can you tell us how to find you online?
Of course,
We don't
sorry.
have
So,
a phone. Yeah.
so I am always online at Latoya Peterson on Twitter. I am at Latoya P on Vine. I am on Facebook. I'm easy to find. I'm at Gmail. You can also hit @Racialicious. You can find me and the whole crew there. And we've written a ton of articles too on technology, interactions, and interface. And so if you go search our archives and you really want to know more about like the intersection of tech and inequality, I've written a ton there. I also wrote a piece on the BartWatch app that's been very, very popular about kind of how human-centered design can be applied to anti-racism and looking at how do you compassionately code applications, particularly ones involving the police. So that's also very easy to find. If you search like BartWatch app racism, that will probably pop up.
Great, thanks so much. Let's hear it for Latoya, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.